Chapter 1, The Ghost of the Lowlands. The lowland fringe was a place where the sun was a myth and the soot was a second skin. It was the industrial gut of the Blackwood Pack's territory, a grey expanse of peat bogs and monolithic textile mills that exhaled thick, sulphurous smoke into a sky the color of a bruised plum. In the fringe, omegas were not the cherished, delicate creatures described in the highborn storybooks. They were the ghosts. They were the labor force that worked the spinning jennies and the heavy looms until their fingers were scarred and their lungs were heavy with wool dust. Danny Vale was a ghost among ghosts. At 20 years old, Danny had perfected the art of invisibility. His scent, sweet cream and crushed mint, was a quiet, cooling thing that he kept buried under layers of coarse, stained wool and the scent of industrial lye. He lived his life in the margins, moving between the grey light of the factory and the damp shadows of the shack he shared with Leo. "The cough is better today, Danny." "Truly," Leo whispered, though the way he huddled under a pile of moth-eaten blankets suggested otherwise. Danny didn't look up from the small, sputtering tallow candle. He was busy counting their meager credits for the week. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. The price of heating oil had risen again, and the lowland winter was beginning to claw at the floorboards. "You're lying, Leo," Danny said softly. He reached out, rubbing his friend's thin, trembling hands. Leo was a fellow Omega, a boy whose spirit had been frayed by the mills and whose body was failing under the damp. "I'll work the double shift at the bog drainage tomorrow. We need the extra credits for medicine." "You can't," Leo said, his voice hitching. He reached under his pillow and pulled out a scroll. It was heavy, cream-colored parchment that looked violently out of place in their mud-stained shack. The seal was black wax, stamped with the sigil of a three-headed wolf. Danny's blood turned to ice. "The Luna Trials. The messenger came to the square today," Leo stammered, his eyes wide with a mix of terror and a desperate, flickering hope. "They called one name from the fringe. Yours. Danny, if you go, the pack sends a candidate's grace. 500 credits. Fuel. Grain. A doctor for the cough. They send it the moment you pass through the estate gates." Danny stared at the scroll. The Luna Trials were a death sentence for someone like him. The ruling alphas of the Blackwood Pack, the three brothers, were legends of ruthlessness and power. They didn't marry for love, they chose a Luna to be a pillar of the pack's strength, a trophy to be polished and displayed. "I'm a fringe rat, Leo," Danny whispered. "They'll break me for sport." "You're a survivor," Leo countered, his grip on Danny's wrist surprisingly strong. "You've kept us alive for 3 years on nothing but grit and stolen apples." "Please, Danny. Not for the crown. For the hearth. For the hope of a house that doesn't leak." Danny looked at his friend, his only family, his greatest weakness. He realized then that his life had been sold the moment that scroll was stamped. He wasn't going to the Blackwood estate to find a mate. He was going on a rescue mission. Chapter 2, The Threshold of Gods. The journey to the Blackwood estate took 4 days by iron carriage, moving from the soot-stained lowlands into the sharp, thin air of the northern peaks. When Danny finally stepped onto the gravel driveway of the manor, the scale of the place made him dizzy. The estate didn't just loom, it exhaled. It was a monument of dark stone, ivy, and ancient glass, nestled against the jagged teeth of the mountains. The other candidates were already gathered in the grand foyer. There were 30 of them, mostly Omegas from vassal packs who had spent their lives being groomed for this moment. They smelled of expensive lilies, sandalwood, and heavy, bottled suppressants. Their silks shimmered like oil on water, and their gazes were sharp with a competitive cruelty that Danny recognized all too well. Danny stood in the center of the marble foyer, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his simple cotton trousers. He smelled of mint, peat smoke, and the lingering fear of the lowlands. He felt like a weed in a palace of orchids. Then, the air changed. A hush fell over the room, a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing down on their shoulders. High above, on the dark wood mezzanine, 3 figures appeared, the 3 kings of Blackwood: Silas, the eldest, stood at the center. He was draped in a tailored black overcoat that made him look like a shadow given form. His presence smelled of bitter espresso and old parchment, a dark, intellectual dominance that felt like a quiet command to kneel. Kaelen, to his left, leaned against the railing with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. He carried the scent of saffron and blackened metal, sharp, expensive, and dangerous, like a blade heated in a forge. Rowan, the youngest and broadest, moved with a restless, feral energy. He smelled of petrichor and wild, dark honey. It was the scent of a storm breaking over a field, raw and sweet all at once. They looked down at the assembly with the bored hunger of gods deciding which part of the world to burn first. The moment Danny's foot hit the center of the marble floor, the atmosphere snapped. Silas didn't just look at Danny, he anchored him. The Alpha's pupils flared, swallowing the steel gray of his irises until they were twin voids. Beside him, Kaelen's smirk vanished, replaced by a predatory tilt of the head. Rowan's hand gripped the stone railing so hard the rock began to fracture under his palm. Mates, the word didn't just echo in Danny's mind, it vibrated in his marrow. His Omega wolf, usually a shy and quiet creature, let out a howl of recognition so loud Danny feared he'd actually made the sound aloud. His knees turned to water. The pull was a physical cord, three-pronged and absolute, dragging his soul toward the stairs. Candidate 31, Silas's voice was a low-frequency vibration that Danny felt in his belly. Name yourself. Danny swallowed, his throat dry as bone. Danny. Danny Vale, of the lowland Fringe. A Fringe Omega, Kaelen mused, his voice like silk over wire. He began to descend the stairs, his movements fluid and terrifyingly graceful. You smell of cool mint in a house full of heavy perfumes, Danny Vale. It's distracting. He stopped just inches from Danny. The scent of saffron and hot metal roared over Danny, making his skin flush. Kaelen reached out, his gloved fingers ghosting over the line of Danny's jaw, never quite touching, yet the heat was unmistakable. Enough, Kaelen, Silas commanded from above. He hadn't moved, but his gaze was a brand. The trials have protocols. We will not disrupt the integrity of the selection process because of a biological curiosity. Curiosity? Rowan let out a dark, rough chuckle, finally moving. He jumped the remaining 6 steps, landing with a heavy thud that made the floorboards groan. He was a wall of muscle, his honey and rain scent wrapping around Danny like a heavy cloak. Brother, your heart is beating so hard I can hear it from the balcony. Don't lie to the little mint drop. Chapter 3, The Trial of the Gilded Cage, Part 1. The subterranean hall of the Blackwood estate was a place where light felt like an uninvited guest. It was a massive, circular cathedral of cold, damp limestone, lit only by the flickering orange tongues of resin-heavy torches that lined the walls. The air was stagnant, tasting of salt and ancient, dormant magic. In the center of this gloom sat 30 glass enclosures, prisons of crystal that shimmered with an unnatural, predatory clarity. As Danny was led to his assigned cage, the heavy glass door hissed shut with a sound like a guillotine. The transition was instant and jarring, the muffled sounds of the other candidates and the distant scraping of the guards' boots vanished. He was alone in a vacuum, his only company the sound of his own pulse hammering against his eardrums. Then, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the hall groaned open, the 3 brothers entered, moving in a synchronized, lethal prowl. They had stripped away their royal finery, wearing only thin black silk shirts that clung to the hard lines of their chests. They didn't look like judges, they looked like hunters who had finally trapped their quarry. Release the pressure, Silas commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it vibrated through the glass, settling in the marrow of Danny's bones. The first hour was a test of gravity. Silas moved first, his aura of bitter espresso and old parchment filling the hall like a rising tide. It wasn't a physical weight, but it felt as though the very air was turning to lead. In the Fringe, Danny had faced hunger, cold, and the crushing monotony of the mills, but this was different. This was a psychic assault. Silas's presence demanded total, unconditional recognition. It was the scent of a library where the books were bound in skin, cold, intellectual, and absolute. Danny's knees buckled instinctively. His Omega wolf, a creature usually buried under layers of soot and survival, began to whine, a submissive, desperate sound that clawed at the back of his throat. Bow, the aura whispered. You are a speck of dust in the gears of a kingdom. Disappear. Danny bit the inside of his cheek until the iron taste of blood filled his mouth. He used that sharp spark of pain to anchor himself. He refused to look at the floor. He forced his chin up, locking eyes with Silas as the Alpha stopped in front of his cage. Up close, Silas's gray eyes weren't just cold, they were a storm of repressed longing. Silas leaned closer, his chest almost touching the glass. You have the eyes of a martyr, Danny Vale, he whispered, his voice a low frequency that bypassed Danny's ears and vibrated in his chest. But martyrs don't lead packs. They break. Tell me, how much weight can those narrow shoulders truly carry before you snap? More than you've ever had to, Danny rasped. He was shaking, but his gaze was a blade. Silas's pupils flared, swallowing the gray of his irises until they were twin voids. A flash of something raw and jagged passed over his face, not the boredom of a king, but the hunger of a man who had finally found a challenge. He lingered a second too long, a crack in his own composure, before he forced himself to move to the next cage. By the second hour, the heat arrived. Rowan circled the cages, his scent of petrichor and dark honey thick enough to taste. It was a carnal, humid fog that triggered a fever in Danny's blood. His wolf began to pace behind his ribs, scratching for a touch that was barred by 4 inches of glass. Rowan didn't stand still like Silas. He paced like a caged animal in front of Danny, his nostrils flaring, his broad shoulders blocking out the torchlight. I can smell your skin warming up, Danny, Rowan growled, slamming a massive palm against the glass. The sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. The mint is turning sweet. You want to be touched. You want to be claimed so badly you can taste it. Why do you fight it? Danny's breath came in ragged gasps, his forehead resting against the cool pane. The pressure from Rowan wasn't an order to submit, it was a demand to belong. It was a raw pull that made Danny's fingers scratch instinctively at the smooth surface. I'm not yours, Danny panted. Not yet, Rowan promised, his gold eyes burning with a fierce, terrifying joy. He leaned his forehead against the glass, closing his eyes as he inhaled the scent leaking through the vents. He looked pained, his knuckles white as he gripped the frame, a silent battle of wills between his duty and his urge to shatter the barrier and take what was his. Chapter 4, The Trial of the Gilded Cage, Part 2. By the 5th hour, the hall was a symphony of failure. The absolute silence of the first hour had been replaced by the jagged sounds of breaking spirits. To Danny's left, a high-born Omega from the northern ridges let out a broken sob, her knees slamming into the floor as she surrendered to the crushing dominance. Further down, the frantic scratching of nails against glass echoed, an Omega who had lost their human mind to the pressure, shifting into a small, trembling wolf that could only howl in terror. Danny was the only one still standing, his legs were locked into place by sheer, fringe-born spite. His tunic was a second skin, soaked through with sweat that chilled his heated flesh. His vision was a narrow tunnel, fixed on a single, jagged crack in the far wall. He was no longer thinking about the stipend or Leo. He was thinking about the 3 pairs of eyes that refused to leave him. The brothers stood at the center of the hall now, a unified front of hunger. They weren't pacing anymore. They stood in a tight triangle, their 3 distinct scents, espresso, saffron, and honey, weaving together into a phenomenal storm so potent that the guards at the door had to look away to avoid the secondary contact. Then, Kaelen approached. The scent of saffron and blackened metal was the most dangerous of all. It didn't crush Danny, and it didn't burn him. It unraveled him. Kaelen stopped directly in front of Danny, his eyes dancing with a wicked, amber light. He looked like a man who knew every secret Danny had ever kept, every fear he had ever buried in the lowland mud. The others are so blunt, Kaelen purred, tracing the outline of Danny's face on the glass with a gloved finger. Silas wants to rule you. Rowan wants to possess you. But I want to see what's underneath all that grit. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a silken thread. You're doing this for a stipend. For a friend. Such small, noble goals for such a magnificent creature. One word, Danny. One whimper. Tell me you're tired. Tell me you want to go home to your little shack. I'll open the door. I'll give you the gold myself and let you run. You don't have to be a Luna. You can just be safe. Danny's vision blurred. The temptation was a siren song. He could have the money. He could save Leo. He could go back to the gray safety of the Fringe and never have to feel this soul-searing pull again. He leaned his forehead against the glass, inches from Kaelen's hand. He looked the Alpha in the eye, fierce with a defiance born from a lifetime of being told he was nothing. I don't want to be safe, Danny hissed, the words burning his throat. And I'm not done with you yet, Alpha. Move on. Kaelen's smirk transformed into a look of pure, unadulterated adoration. He let out a shaky breath, his hand lingering on the glass for a heartbeat longer than the rules allowed. Gods, Kaelen breathed. You're going to be the death of us. Time, Silas announced. His voice was a jagged rasp, stripped of its usual regal polish, the glass walls retracted with a soft, mechanical hiss, the sudden influx of oxygen and the total, violent release of the pressure was too much. Danny's legs finally gave way. He felt his balance vanish, the marble floor rising up like a dark sea. He never hit the ground in a flash of black silk and radiating heat, the three of them were there. Silas caught his head and shoulders, his hand cradling Danny's skull with a terrifying tenderness. Rowan caught his waist, his arm a solid iron bar pulling Danny's lower body flush against his own massive, trembling thighs. Kaelen caught Danny's arms, his fingers digging into his skin as if he feared the omega might vanish, the harmony of their scents, espresso, honey, and saffron, crashed over Danny. His wolf finally broke its silence, letting out a soft, broken whimper of pure recognition, mates. We have you, Rowan growled, his voice a low vibration against Danny's hip. We have you, little mint. He's freezing, Kaelen noted, his voice sharp with a protective edge. He began rubbing Danny's arms, his touch frantic. Silas didn't speak. He simply pulled Danny closer, burying his face in the crook of Danny's neck, inhaling the exhausted scent of mint. His entire body was shaking, the great, stoic Alpha was vibrating with the effort of not marking Danny right there on the floor. The elders are coming, Silas whispered against Danny's skin. We have to let you go. For now. No, Rowan rumbled, his grip tightening. Rowan, Silas warned. If we claim him now, he loses the title. He becomes a consort. He wants the throne. He wants the power. We give him what he wants. Slowly, they began to peel away. The loss of their heat was a physical agony. Danny slumped against a stone pillar, watching through hooded eyes as the brothers straightened their shirts and rebuilt their masks of indifference. But as they walked away, Kaelen looked back. His amber eyes were dark with a promise so heavy it felt like a brand. Sleep, Danny Vale, Silas's voice echoed. Tomorrow, the palace will not be so kind. Danny watched them leave, his heart beating a frantic rhythm. He realized then that the trial hadn't been a test of his submission. It had been a test of theirs. And they had all failed. The transition from the cold, damp stone of the subterranean hall to the opulent upper wings of the Blackwood estate was a jar to the system. Danny was no longer treated as a nameless ghost from the Fringe, he was handled like a fragile explosive. The servants who bathed him were silent and trembling, scrubbed him until his skin was raw and pink, and dressed him in fabrics that cost more than a year's output from his old textile mill, but as he looked in the mirror, Danny knew the danger hadn't passed. The Alphas had shown their hand in the cages, but the pack was more than just 3 men. It was a centuries-old machine of blood and gold, and it was about to try and chew him up. Chapter 5, The Trial of the Gilded Mirror, Part 1. The gilded mirror was the pack's polite euphemism for social execution. It was a test designed to see if an Omega could not only survive the alphas but command the aristocrats who whispered behind their fans. Danny stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in his suite, staring at a stranger. The soot was gone, replaced by a complexion like polished ivory. He was draped in a suit of midnight blue velvet, the fabric so heavy and rich it felt like a second skin. A sapphire the size of a pigeon's egg was pinned to his stiff collar, cold against his throat that he smelled of sweet cream and mint, but the scent was sharper now, clarified by the adrenaline of survival. The trial of the mirror is simple, a head servant whispered, cinching Danny's silk waistcoat until he was forced to stand with a rigid, regal spine. You must navigate the gala. You must not break character. You must endure the biting tongues of the pack aristocracy. And above all, you must dance with the kings. The Lion's Den. The grand ballroom was a dizzying expanse of gold leaf and crystal chandeliers that dripped light like melting diamonds. The air was a suffocating cloud of expensive perfumes, lilies, jasmine, and heavy musk, designed to mask the scent of competition. The 30 original candidates had been culled to 10. The high-born Omegas, daughters of dukes and sons of barons, stood in clusters, their gazes sharp and jagged as broken glass. Look at him, a girl from the northern peaks sneered as Danny entered. Her scent of roses had turned thorny and sour. They say he still smells like peat moss under that stolen silk. A pity the alphas wasted their time catching him last night. He should have been left to hit the floor. Danny gripped his champagne flute, his knuckles white. In the Fringe, a stray comment was met with a blunt retort or a fist. Here, the violence was subtle. Every whisper was a social blade meant to draw blood without leaving a scar. He felt the weight of his fringe rat status like a physical brand. Then, the music stopped, the three brothers appeared at the top of the grand staircase. They were in full military dress, medals gleaming against black wool, shoulders broad, their combined dominance radiating off the mezzanine like a physical heat. Silas looked down, his expression a mask of cold, unapproachable marble. Bitter espresso. Kaelen scanned the room with a predatory smirk, his gloved hand resting casually on the gold hilt of a ceremonial saber. Saffron. Rowan looked restless, his gold eyes searching the crowd with a fierce intensity until they locked onto Danny. Dark honey. The room held its breath. The alphas descended, and the crowd parted like a wounded thing. Chapter 6. The Trial of the Gilded Mirror, Part 2. The first dance. Silas the eldest reached Danny first. He didn't look at the other candidates, he didn't even acknowledge the bowing elders. He stopped inches from Danny, his presence a dark, intellectual wall. Candidate 31, Silas said, his voice a low thrum that made the champagne in Danny's glass ripple. He bowed, a sharp, terrifyingly elegant gesture. This dance belongs to the crown. Silas didn't wait for a verbal answer. He took Danny's hand, his grip firm and cool, and led him into the center of the floor. As the orchestra struck a haunting, slow waltz, the world blurred into a swirl of gold and blue. Silas was a masterful dancer, leading Danny with a silent, mathematical precision. They are whispering about your bloodline, Danny, Silas murmured, his lips inches from Danny's ear as they spun. They say a ghost of the lowlands cannot hold the grace required for this floor. They have bets placed on how many steps it takes for you to stumble. Then they're going to lose their gold, Danny rasped, his eyes fixed on Silas's silver-gray orbs. Good, Silas whispered, his hand sliding an inch lower on Danny's back, a possessive heat seeping through the velvet. Focus on me. Use my strength to steady your own. Show them that a king chooses his equal, not his shadow. The second dance. Kaelen. As the music shifted to a faster, more erratic tempo, Silas stepped back, and Kaelen surged forward. He didn't bow, he caught Danny's waist and pulled him into a spin that made the chandeliers dance. Silas is too stiff, Kaelen laughed, the scent of saffron and blackened metal swirling around them like a drug. He dances like he's signing a treaty. I prefer a bit more friction. Kaelen moved with a dangerous, feline grace. He guided Danny through the thickest parts of the crowd, deliberately brushing past the Omegas who had sneered at him earlier, forcing them to scatter in his wake. "I heard what they said to you about the peat moss," Kaelen whispered, his amber eyes dancing with a wicked, protective light. "I could have them removed from the ballroom in 5 minutes. Or would you prefer to watch me make them crawl for an invitation to the next hunt?" "I don't need a knight, Kaelen," Danny said, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I just need you to keep up." Kaelen's laugh was a sharp, delighted sound. He spun Danny around, his hand lingering for a heartbeat too long on the small of Danny's back. "You're sharp as a razor, little mint drop. Be careful. You might start making me feel things I haven't felt in a century." The third dance, Rowan. When the music slowed to a deep, primal rhythm, Rowan stepped in. He didn't dance, he claimed. He wrapped his massive arms around Danny, pulling him so close their hearts beat in a frantic, shared rhythm. The scent of petrichor and honey was a tidal wave that drowned out the room. "I hate this," Rowan growled, his voice a low rumble Danny felt in his very marrow. "The clothes. The perfume. The way these vultures look at you like you're a prize they can bid on." "It's a trial, Rowan," Danny whispered, his hands resting on Rowan's broad, unyielding shoulders. "It's a circus," Rowan countered. He pulled back just enough to look Danny in the eyes. His gold irises were glowing. "You don't belong in a room full of glass and lace. You belong in the wild. You belong with us, away from these people." Rowan's hand moved to the back of Danny's neck, his thumb stroking the sensitive skin there. For a moment, Danny forgot the ballroom. He forgot the gala. He forgot everything but the raw, honest heat of the youngest brother. "Just a little longer," Rowan promised, his voice thick with hunger. "Tomorrow, the hunt begins. And I won't be wearing white gloves when I catch you." The verdict. The music faded. The brothers stepped back, forming a triangle around Danny in the center of the ballroom. The socialites were silent, their faces pale with the realization that the Fringe rat hadn't just survived the gala, he had dominated it. Danny stood in the center, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. He had danced with 3 gods and hadn't stumbled once. Silas stepped forward, his eyes sweeping the room with a gaze that made the aristocrats flinch. "The trial of the mirror is concluded," he announced. 5 more candidates have been dismissed for failing to maintain their composure under the pressure of the crown. He looked at Danny, a flash of undeniable, burning pride crossing his stoic features. "There are only 5 of you left," Silas said. "Prepare yourselves. Tomorrow, we leave the gold and the glass behind. Tomorrow, the forest claims its own." Danny watched them leave, his body still humming from their touch. He realized with a jolt that he wasn't just fighting for a stipend anymore. He was fighting for the right to stand beside them, to be the storm that matched their own. Chapter 7, The Trial of the Wild, Part 1. The sun had not yet breached the jagged peaks of the northern mountains when the remaining 5 candidates were assembled at the edge of the wilds. The wilds were not a park or a curated garden, they were a vast, unmapped expanse of ancient timber, sheer stone ravines, and freezing glacial streams. In the gray, pre-dawn light, the forest looked like a slumbering beast, its breath a thick, rolling fog that tasted of pine resin and damp earth. Danny stood apart from the other 4 Omegas. They were dressed in expensive, brand-new hunting leathers that creaked with every movement. Danny, however, had made a choice. He had discarded the fine silks of the gala for a set of rugged, dark gray woolens he had modified himself, binding his shins with leather strips and darkening his pale skin with soot and crushed charcoal. He looked less like a candidate and more like a shadow belonging to the woods. "The rules are absolute," the High Elder announced, his voice thin and brittle in the cold air. "The sunstone sits at the highest point of the great ridge. Reach it before the moon rises, and you prove your worth to lead. But be warned, the kings are already within the tree line. If an alpha catches you, you are claimed. You are disqualified from the throne. You become a consort, a trophy, not a ruler. Danny's heart thrummed. A trophy. Silas's words from the cage echoed in his mind. He wants the power. We give him what he wants. The horn sounded, a deep, guttural blast that vibrated in Danny's very marrow. The other candidates bolted for the main trailhead, their boots pounding the gravel. Danny didn't move. He closed his eyes, centering his breathing, letting the scent of the forest wash over him. He wasn't looking for a path, he was looking for an opening. He dove into a thicket of thorns that the others wouldn't have dared touch, his smaller frame slipping through the brambles with a fluid, silent grace. The first shadow, Rowan 2 hours into the ascent, the air turned humid and heavy. The birdsong stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so thick it felt like a physical weight, dark honey and petrichor. Rowan was close. The youngest brother didn't believe in stealth, he believed in the sheer, overwhelming force of nature. Danny could hear the snap of dry branches 100 yards behind him, deliberate, mocking sounds. Rowan was flushing him out like a hound with a fox. Danny reached a massive, moss-covered oak near a sheer drop-off. He knew he couldn't outrun Rowan's raw power on flat ground. Instead, he pulled a small pouch of dried mint and crushed lye from his pocket, remnants of the Fringe mills, and scattered it at the base of the tree. Then, with a burst of adrenaline, he climbed out. He didn't stop at the lower branches. He went higher, into the thin, swaying canopy where the wood was flexible and dangerous. Rowan burst into the clearing moments later. He looked feral. His black shirt was torn, his gold eyes glowing with a light that was almost blinding in the forest gloom. He stopped at the base of the oak, his nostrils flaring as the sharp, chemical scent of the lye hit him, masking Danny's natural cream and mint. "Clever little ghost," Rowan roared, his voice bouncing off the ravine walls. He prowled around the trunk, his hand trailing over the bark, leaving deep furrows in the wood. "You think you can hide from me in the clouds? I can hear your heart, Danny. It's drumming a rhythm I want to feel against my own chest." Danny held his breath, pressing his body so tight against the high limb that the bark bit into his skin. He watched as Rowan leaned into the tree, his body trembling with the effort of the hunt. Rowan looked up, his gaze sweeping the leaves. For a second, their eyes met, a spark of gold meeting Danny's defiance. Rowan smirked. He didn't climb. Instead, he slammed his shoulder into the trunk, a blow so powerful the entire tree shuddered. "Keep running, Danny. If I catch you now, I'll never let you reach that stone. And I want to see you win almost as much as I want to break you." With a wink that was pure, terrifying promise, Rowan turned and vanished into the brush, leaving Danny shaking in the heights. Chapter 8, The Trial of the Wild, Part 2. By midday, the forest had changed. The lush greenery gave way to the gray scree, a landscape of jagged slate and treacherous, shifting stone. This was Kaelen's territory. The scent of saffron and blackened metal didn't come from behind, it was everywhere, carried by the wind that whipped through the mountain passes. Danny was exhausted. His lungs, scarred by the wool dust of the Fringe, were burning in the thin mountain air. He reached a narrow natural bridge of stone that spanned 100-foot drop. In the center of that bridge sat Kaelen. He was sitting on a jagged rock, idly sharpening a long hunting knife with a whetstone. The sound, shink, 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 was a rhythmic threat. "You're late, Danny," Kaelen purred without looking up. "The others are already back at the estate, nursing their bruises and their pride. You're the only one left in the game." "Then move," Danny panted, wiping sweat and soot from his brow. Kaelen stood, his movements like a cat's, fluid, silent, and deadly. He tucked the knife away and began to walk across the narrow bridge toward Danny. "Why the rush? The view here is magnificent. And you look breathtaking when you're cornered." Kaelen stopped just a foot away. The wind howled between them, but the Alpha's presence was a vacuum of heat. He reached out, his gloved fingers catching a stray lock of Danny's hair. "The elders expect me to bring you in," Kaelen whispered, his amber eyes searching Danny's face with a sudden, jarring intensity. They want me to claim you here, on the stone, to prove that an Omega can't master the wild. If I touch you now, Danny, the stipend still goes to Leo. You get the house. You get the grain. You just don't get the crown. It was the ultimate temptation. Kaelen was offering him everything he had originally come for, without the burden of the throne. Danny looked down at the drop, then back at Kaelen. He reached out, not to push Kaelen away, but to grip the Alpha's forearm. You told me in the ballroom that I looked like I wanted to burn this palace down, Danny rasped. I can't do that if I'm just a consort in your bed, Kaelen. I'm going to that stone. Kaelen's breath hitched. A look of agonizing pride washed over his face, warring with the raw hunger of his wolf. He leaned down, his nose brushing Danny's temple. Then go, he breathed, his voice a jagged thread. Run, before I lose my mind and tackle you into the slate. But know this, the eldest is waiting at the summit. And Silas doesn't play with his food. Kaelen stepped aside, giving Danny the path. As Danny scrambled past, he felt Kaelen's hand ghost over his waist, not a claim, but a silent prayer for his success. The summit's edge, the final ascent, was a vertical nightmare. Danny's fingernails were torn, his knees were bloodied, and his scent, the mint and cream, was radiating in a frantic, feverish heat. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and gold, Danny pulled himself over the final ridge. There, in the center of a clearing of white quartz, stood the sunstone, and standing before it was Silas. He wasn't disheveled like Rowan or playful like Kaelen. He stood like a statue of dark marble, his black coat whipped by the summit winds. The scent of bitter espresso and old parchment was so cold it felt like winter was arriving early. You're at the end, Danny Vale, Silas said, his voice echoing across the peaks. He didn't move toward Danny. He simply waited. The stone is 10 feet away. All you have to do is touch it, and you are the first Luna in a century to win the trials by right of merit. Danny tried to move, but his body finally hit its limit. He stumbled, falling to his hands and knees in the dirt. Silas was across the clearing in an instant. He didn't claim him, he knelt in the dirt beside him, his large hands hovering over Danny's trembling shoulders, refusing to touch him and disqualify him, even though every muscle in the Alpha's body was taut with the urge to pull him close. Stand up, Silas commanded, though his voice was thick with an emotion that sounded suspiciously like heartbreak. Stand up, Danny. Don't let the Fringe win today. Don't let the mountains win. Stand up and take your throne. Danny looked up at the man who had been his primary tormentor and his greatest obsession. He saw the truth in Silas's eyes. The eldest brother didn't want a subject. He wanted a partner who could stand in the storm beside him. With a scream of pure, unadulterated willpower, Danny forced himself up. He used Silas's presence as an anchor, but he didn't touch him. He took one step. 2. On the third step, his hand slammed against the smooth, glowing surface of the sunstone. The quartz flared with a blinding, white light that shot into the darkening sky. Danny felt the bond, the three-way cord of espresso, honey, and saffron, snap into a final, permanent alignment. He felt the life of the pack, the strength of the mountains, and the hearts of the three brothers all rush into his soul at once. He began to fall, but this time, he didn't have to worry. Silas caught him, pulling him into a crushing, desperate embrace as Rowan and Kaelen breached the ridge, their scents exploding in a joyous, feral harmony. Ours, Silas whispered into Danny's hair, tears he would never admit to shedding dampening the soot on Danny's skin. Our Luna. Our center. Chapter 9, The Chamber of Cinerus. The Sunstone had recognized Danny's right to rule, but the ancient laws of the Blackwood Pack were written in more than just stone. They were written in the blood and the aura. Winning the hunt had proven Danny's resilience. Now, he had to prove he could survive the combined psychic weight of 3 Alpha Kings without being erased by them. 2 days after the hunt, Danny was led deep beneath the manor, past the Hall of Whispers, into the Cinerus Sanctum. It was a circular chamber carved from obsidian, where the air was so thick with the history of the pack it felt like breathing liquid velvet. There were no torches here, only the dim, pulsing glow of bioluminescent moss that clung to the ceiling like a map of a forgotten galaxy. In the center of the room was a raised dais. Silas, Kaelen, and Rowan were already there, stripped to the waist. In the dim light, the tattoos on their backs, interlocking wolves and ancient runes, seemed to move. The high elders sat in the shadows, their voices overlapping in a rhythmic chant. "The three are the pillars," they intoned. "But a house of 3 pillars without a roof is a ruin." Candidate 31, step into the eye of the storm. Danny stepped onto the dais. He felt small between them, yet the way their scents, bitter espresso, saffron, and wild honey, swirled toward him was not an attack. It was a plea. "This is the trial of the center," Silas whispered, his gray eyes reflecting the moss light. "We are going to release everything, Danny. Every instinct, every bit of dominance we usually keep caged to protect the world from us. If you cannot harmonize us, the feedback will shatter your mind. We will be forced to reject the bond to save your life." "I've survived the mills, the cages, and your mountain," Danny said, his voice echoing with a new, resonant strength. "I'm not going anywhere." "Then let go," Kaelen murmured, reaching out to brush Danny's cheek. "Don't fight us. Be the gravity that holds us." The first wave, the weight of the crown. Silas was the first to open his mind. It felt like a mountain of ice collapsing into Danny's consciousness. Silas's aura wasn't just a scent, it was a psychic landscape of bitter espresso and frozen parchment. Danny felt the crushing loneliness of leadership, the thousands of lives Silas accounted for, the cold logic of survival, the centuries of tradition that demanded Silas be a statue instead of a man. The weight was staggering. Danny's knees buckled. It felt as if Silas's dominance was a dark ink, staining Danny's soul, trying to turn him into a mere reflection of the high alpha's will. "I am not a shadow," Danny thought, his mind flickering to the soot-stained streets of the Fringe. "I am the one who survived when the shadows tried to swallow me." Instead of pushing Silas back, Danny reached out with his own scent, crushed mint and sweet cream. He wrapped the coolness of the mint around Silas's frozen logic, softening the sharp edges of the alpha's burden. He didn't fight the weight, he shared it. The air in the room hummed. The espresso scent didn't vanish, but it turned rich and warm, like a hearth fire in a winter storm. Chapter 10, The Triple Eclipse. Then came Rowan. The youngest brother didn't wait for an invitation. His aura exploded like a forest fire, petrichor and dark honey. It was raw, carnal, and violent. It was the hunger of the wolf that wanted to claim, to mark, and to protect with a ferocity that bordered on madness. The heat was agonizing. Danny felt his skin flush, his heart rate spiking to dangerous levels. Rowan's energy was a chaotic storm that threatened to burn away Danny's identity, leaving nothing but a submissive mate. "Danny, hold on." Rowan's voice groaned in the physical world, but in the psychic realm, it was a roar. Danny gasped for air, his fingers clutching at the obsidian floor. He felt Kaelen's energy beginning to bleed in as well, saffron and blackened metal, sharp needles of intellect and insecurity, slicing through the gaps in Danny's focus. The 3 scents were no longer distinct. They were a cacophony. A 3-way tug-of-war with Danny's soul as the rope. The elders began to murmur in alarm. The feedback was growing loud enough to make the obsidian walls vibrate. The center, Danny reminded himself, his vision tunneling. The center isn't the strongest point. It's the balance point. That he stopped trying to manage them individually. He closed his eyes and sank into the core of his own being, the ghost of the lowlands, who had nothing but his own resilience. He didn't act as a shield. He became a conduit. Danny opened his spirit completely, inviting all 3 of them in at once. He allowed the bitter espresso to mix with the wild honey, he let the sharp saffron slice through the petrichor. He injected his own sweet cream into the mixture, acting as the binder, the velvet that allowed the clashing elements to touch without destroying one another. The effect was instantaneous. The room went silent. The vibrating walls stilled. In the psychic space, the 3 brothers gasped as their energies were pulled into a perfect, orbiting circle around Danny. For the first time in their lives, the alphas felt peace. The constant, internal friction of their competing dominances was gone, smoothed over by Danny's cooling mint and stabilizing cream. Danny stood up in the center of the dais, his eyes glowing a brilliant, ethereal icy blue, the mark of a true Luna. He reached out his hands. Silas took the left, Rowan took the right, and Kaelen stepped behind him, his arms wrapping around Danny's chest, his chin resting on Danny's shoulder. They were no longer three alphas and a candidate. They were a singularity. The scent in the room transformed into something new, a fragrance that would, from that day forward, define the Blackwood pack. It was the smell of a forest after a storm, sweetened by cream, deepened by espresso, and spiced by the exotic heat of saffron. The harmonization is complete, the High Elder's voice rose from the dark, trembling with awe. The center holds. The kings have their queen. Danny leaned his head back against Kaelen, his breath finally evening out. The bond was a golden lattice in his mind, glowing with the love and fierce protection of the three men who had tried to break him, only to find that he was the only thing capable of making them whole. "You did it," Silas whispered, his voice thick with a reverence that made Danny's heart ache. "You actually did it, Danny." "I told you," Danny panted, a small, tired smirk playing on his lips. "I'm not a ghost anymore. I'm the one who haunts you." Rowan let out a jagged, happy laugh, burying his face in Danny's neck. "Haunt us forever, then. We aren't letting you go." Chapter 11, The Rite of the Silver Moon. The transition from the subterranean dark to the morning of the coronation felt like a rebirth. The Blackwood estate, once a monument of intimidating stone and cold tradition, had been transformed. For the first time in a century, the great hall was draped not in the black and gray of the alphas, but in the shimmering, iridescent white of the Luna. Danny stood in the dressing chambers, but he was no longer the trembling boy who had arrived in cotton trousers. He stood as the center. His presence was a calm, cooling draft in the room, his scent of sweet cream and mint now carrying a regal, underlying depth, the weight of three kings' souls resting in his hands. The coronation robes were a masterpiece of craftsmanship. They were made of Luna silk, a fabric woven from the fibers of moon-blooming lilies. It was a translucent, shimmering white that seemed to hold its own light, embroidered with silver threads that mimicked the jagged peaks of the north. Around his throat, the sapphire from the gala had been replaced. Now, he wore the heart of the north, a diamond that had been in the Blackwood line since the first wolf walked the earth. "You look like a god," a voice whispered. Danny turned. It was Leo. His friend was no longer the hollow-cheeked boy from the shack. He was dressed in the fine wool of a pack administrator, his skin healthy, his eyes clear. The candidate's grace had done its work. The doctors had flushed the soot from his lungs, and the grain stores Danny had secured had filled his frame. "I look like a target," Danny joked, though his voice lacked its old bitterness. He walked over and took Leo's hands. "Is the house ready?" "It's more than a house, Danny," Leo said, his voice thick with emotion. "The southern quarter, it's breathing again. They're calling it the Mint District. Because of you." A heavy knock at the door signaled the end of the quiet. The doors swung open, and the three kings entered. They were a terrifyingly beautiful sight. They wore their full ceremonial armor, black steel etched with silver. Silas looked at Danny with a gaze that was no longer calculating, but worshipful. Bitter espresso, Kaelen paced around Danny, his eyes trailing over the white silk with a possessive heat. Saffron, Rowan stood the closest, his hand twitching as if he were fighting the urge to ruin the expensive silk by pulling Danny into his arms. Wild honey. "The pack is waiting," Silas said, extending his hand. "They have lived in the cold for too long, Danny. Show them the sun." The coronation. The walk to the balcony was a blur of silver and gold. As Danny stepped out into the crisp mountain air, a roar erupted from the thousands of pack members gathered below that nearly shook the stone beneath his feet. They weren't just cheering for a mate. They were cheering for the end of the long winter of the three brothers' clashing dominances. The harmony that Danny radiated was felt by every wolf in the territory. It was a psychic balm that eased the tension in their own souls. The High Elder stepped forward, holding a bowl of silver ink. He looked at the four of them, his hands trembling. The pack is a body. The alphas are the muscle and the bone. But the Luna is the blood that carries the life. He dipped his fingers in the ink and traced a line from Silas's heart to Danny's, then from Rowan's, and finally from Kaelen's. Do you, Danny Vale, accept the weight of these three souls? Do you vow to be their anchor, their conscience, and their home? Danny looked at the brothers. He felt the golden bond hum, a vibrant, singing wire that connected his mind to theirs. He felt Silas's pride, Rowan's devotion, and Kaelen's adoration. I do, Danny's voice rang out, carried by the mountain wind. Then behold your Luna, the elder cried. As the brothers knelt, before Danny in front of the entire pack, the bond solidified. The scent of mint, cream, espresso, saffron, and honey exploded outward in a psychic shockwave that turned the sky a brilliant, shimmering violet. Danny didn't wait for the cheers to die down. He stepped to the edge of the stone railing, his eyes fixed on the distant smoke of the lowlands. My first decree, he shouted, and the crowd went silent. The Fringe is no more. From this day, the lowlands are the heart of our industry, not its waste. No wolf shall sleep in soot. No child shall work the looms. The wealth of the peaks shall flow to the valleys, and the strength of the valleys shall protect the peaks. We are one pack. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat before the world seemed to break with the sound of their approval. Danny felt a hand on his waist. Silas leaned in, his forehead resting against Danny's. You're already a better king than all of us combined, the Alpha whispered. Chapter 12, The Epilogue, The Hearth of the North. 6 months had passed since the night in the Cinerus Sanctum. The Blackwood estate was no longer a place of exhaling stone and suppressed fear. Under Danny's influence, the heavy velvet drapes had been pulled back to let in the mountain sun, and the air smelled of wood smoke, fresh lilies, and the heady blend of the ruling four. Danny sat in the conservatory, looking over architectural blueprints for the new medical wing in the southern quarter. He wore a soft, charcoal wool sweater, a gift from Silas, and a silver chain around his neck that bore the crest of the pack. A heavy pair of arms wrapped around his waist from behind, and the scent of wild honey and petrichor flooded his senses. You're working too hard, little mint, Rowan rumbled, his voice vibrating against Danny's spine. He nuzzled into Danny's neck, his scruff tickling the sensitive skin there. Kaelen has the horses ready. He's been pacing the stables for 20 minutes. Danny leaned back into the massive Alpha's chest, a small smile playing on his lips. I promised the elders I'd have the foundations poured before the first frost, Rowan. And you will, a cool, steady voice interrupted. Silas stepped into the room, holding a cup of steaming espresso. He set the cup down and leaned over, pressing a lingering kiss to Danny's forehead. The materials have already been dispatched. Your word is law, Danny. Did you think we would let your first decree go unfulfilled? I just want to make sure they're warm, Danny whispered. I want to make sure no one has to choose between medicine and bread. They won't, Kaelen said, appearing in the doorway. He was dressed in riding leathers, his amber eyes softened the moment they landed on Danny. He walked over and took Danny's hand, rubbing his thumb over the gold band on Danny's finger. The South has its protector. The visit to the quarter later that afternoon, the four of them rode down the mountain. It was a sight that usually brought the territory to a standstill, 3 Alpha Kings following their Luna with a fierce, protective focus. As they entered the southern quarter, the change was undeniable. The soot-stained brick had been scrubbed, and the heavy, sulphurous smoke of the mills had been replaced by the clean scent of modern filtration. They stopped in front of a sturdy, 2-story house built of warm cedar and stone. It had a wide porch and a chimney that was currently puffing out a steady, cheerful stream of white smoke. The door flew open, and a figure came sprinting out. Danny. Leo looked like a different person. He had put on weight, his cheeks were flushed with health, and the hacking cough was gone. He stopped just short of the horses, bowing his head respectfully to the Alphas, but his eyes were shining as he looked at Danny. Danny slid off his horse, with Rowan and Kaelen both reaching out to steady him, and threw his arms around his friend. The hearth, Leo, Danny whispered into his hair. Does it smoke? And not a bit, Leo laughed, his stutter barely a ghost of what it used to be. And the G-grain stores are full. The doctor says I'm fit enough to start overseeing the new library. Danny pulled back, looking at the life he had managed to carve out, not just for himself, but for the person who had kept him alive when the world was gray. He looked back at his three mates, who were watching the reunion with quiet, possessive pride. He realized then that the Luna trials hadn't been about proving he was strong enough to survive the Alphas. They had been about finding the three men who were strong enough to support the weight of his heart. Ready to go home, Luna? Silas asked, extending a hand to help Danny back onto his mount. Danny took his hand, feeling the spark of the bond flare bright and steady. He looked at the thriving town, then at his friend, and finally at the three Alphas who would burn the world down to keep him smiling. I am home, Danny said. As they turned their horses back toward the mountain peaks, the scent of mint and cream drifted on the wind, weaving perfectly between the espresso, the saffron, and the honey. The storm had passed, and for the first time in the history of the Blackwood Pack, the sun was finally shining on everyone.